Hello everybody, me Aditya. Today we will deal with respiration. In the last lecture we have already discussed what digestion is, what are the products of digestion, the process of digestion, types of nutrition, etc, etc. So in this chapter we will take a look on respiration, which is also an important biological, or we can say a life process, very important life process, and it is very essential for living, very essential for survival of a living organism. So what is respiration? So respiration is a process. Respiration is a complex process actually, in which we take in oxygen, we humans take in oxygen, and that oxygen in breaking down of simpler food molecules in the sense glucose, amino acid, fatty acid and glycerols, which we have already discussed in the last chapter. So respiration is a process in which we take in oxygen and use this oxygen in breakdown of simpler food to release energy. So the core target of respiration, the main target of respiration is release of energy from the food which we had taken. So in nutrition we take in food, and in respiration we release energy from that particular food. Okay, so in respiration we release energy from the food we taken in, which we have discussed in respiration. How do we take in the food and how those foods are converted into simpler molecules? So before watching this lecture, must watch the previous one to understand in a better way. So respiration completes in two steps. The first is gaseous exchange, we refer it breathing. The second is cellular respiration. So in the first step, that is gaseous exchange, the intake of oxygen and exhale of carbon dioxide. The intake of oxygen and exhale of carbon dioxide. Intake of oxygen through nose. N-O-S-E, nose. The intake of oxygen is through nose. In human beings particularly, it is from nose. The respiratory organs are different in different organs. Respiratory organs are actually different in different organisms. So in humans, the respiratory organ is lungs. The lungs, lungs situated in the pleural cavity. So lungs is the respiratory organ in humans. So the gases exchange takes place at the lungs. The gases exchange takes place at the lungs, where oxygen is diffused into the lungs and carbon dioxide is diffused from the lungs. Oxygen is diffused into the lungs. Note my words. The oxygen is absorbed into the lungs, and the carbon dioxide is diffused out of the lungs. Or diffused from the lungs. Okay, so after this intake of oxygen, the oxygen is used to release energy inside the cell. Oxygen is used to release energy inside the cell, and this process is known as cellular respiration. So respiration is divided into two steps: breathing and cellular respiration. Breathing is actually also called external respiration, in which oxygen is taken in and transported to the cells. So this process is known as external respiration, and when this oxygen is absorbed by the cells, it is then used in breaking down to release energy. So this is also known as cellular respiration. So respiration completes in two steps. First is external and second is internal. In external respiration, the food is taken and used. Actually, in external respiration, the oxygen is taken in by the body. And this oxygen is transported to the organs, or more specifically to the cells where this is needed. So in external respiration, oxygen is taken in and transported to the cells where it is needed, and in internal respiration, this oxygen is utilized to release energy. Okay, so let's move ahead. So in cellular respiration, we have to study breakdown of glucose. Okay, cellular respiration is of many types. Actually, we have learned in the last chapter that the food we take in is broken down into glucose or amino acid or fatty acid. So these all are simpler molecules. The amino acid, fatty acid, it is all are simpler molecules. So these simpler molecules are also broken down by the process called respiration, but we have to study just glucose. Okay, so this glucose respiration to form energy performs in cytoplasm as well as in mitochondria. So in cytoplasm, the glucose is converted into pyruvic acid. Okay, the glucose is converted into pyruvic acid, and this process is known as glycolysis. This process is known as glycolysis. The glycolysis, what do you mean by glycolysis? So glyco means glucose. This is glucose, and lysis means breakdown. Glyco means glucose, lysis means breakdown. So the term glycolysis means breakdown of glucose. So the breakdown of glucose takes place in the cytoplasm, which completes in 10 steps. completes in 10 steps. So in cytoplasm, glucose is broken down into pyruvic acid in the combination of 10 steps, and the steps are altogether known as glycolytic steps. Okay, so this pyruvic acid is now utilized by the cells. This pyruvic acid has two fate. Okay, the first fate is in presence of oxygen, and the second in absence of oxygen. Presence of oxygen and absence of oxygen. So in presence of oxygen, the process is known as aerobic, and in absence of oxygen, the process is known as anaerobic. So respiration is of two types: aerobic respiration, anaerobic respiration. Aerobic means take place in the presence of oxygen. Aerobic respiration takes place in the presence of oxygen, and anaerobic takes place in absence of oxygen. Not just absence, if there is presence of very less amount of oxygen, means the need of oxygen is more than the presence of oxygen, then the process anaerobic respiration takes place. Aerobic respiration takes place in mitochondria, and aerobic respiration in mitochondria and anaerobic in cytoplasm. Aerobic in mitochondria, anaerobic in cytoplasm. The end product of aerobic respiration is carbon dioxide, oxygen, and huge amount of energy. In aerobic respiration, carbon dioxide, water, and huge amount of energy is released, almost 38 ATP molecules. But in anaerobic respiration, the end products are either alcohol or lactic acid. So lactic acid is basically formed in our muscles. When we do complex exercises. And alcohol is formed in yeast. Yeast is a fungi which processes fermentation, and the process is known as anaerobic respiration, and alcohol is formed, but the release of energy is very low. Here 2 ATP. So in this process, 38 ATP in aerobic respiration and 2 ATP in anaerobic respiration. Okay, now in aerobic respiration or anaerobic respiration, the glycolysis process, glycolysis, is common in both the processes. Either it is in absence of oxygen or presence of oxygen. Glycolysis is common to all. So note this, glycolysis is the common process for both aerobic and anaerobic type of respiration. So in anaerobic respiration, there is either formation of ethanol or lactic acid. Ethanol is formed in yeast. And lactic acid in muscles. And in presence of oxygen, carbon dioxide, water, energy is formed in mitochondria generally. Now we need to take a look on human respiratory system. So the human respiratory system consists of this. Human respiratory system. So in human respiratory system begins right from your nostrils, then nasal passes, nasal cavity, pharynx, larynx, trachea, bronchi, lungs, bronchioles, and alveolar, then blood capillaries. Now what is alveoli? What is this? Okay, so let's have a look to this. Look, this is our respiratory system, where we inhale oxygen. It comes like this goes to lungs, are absorbed here, and then transported through the blood capillaries to different cells of our body. Okay, so the respiratory tract, this passage known as respiratory tract. So respiratory tract consists of this lungs, trachea, bronchi. Okay, so larynx, pharynx, trachea, bronchi. So you need to take a look to the structure. When the oxygen enters from here, there is presence of larynx or voice box. From larynx, it goes down the trachea. The trachea divides to form bronchi. This is bronchi. Trachea divides to form two bronchi. These bronchi further divide and form bronchioles. And these bronchioles end up to a very thin sac-like structures, or we can say bubble-like structures, known as alveoli. So alveoli are the bubble-like structures. Note it in your copy. Alveoli is a bubble-like structure which generally or specifically helps in absorption of oxygen and also diffusion of carbon dioxide through it. So alveoli is a thin membrane. Alveoli is a thin membrane-like structure, thin membrane sac-like structure, where the oxygen and carbon dioxide are exchanged into the lungs. There is a very popular question: the difference between alveoli and villi which are present in small intestine, and alveoli is present in lungs. So there is difference between both. Are made to absorb, both are made to absorb something. This absorbs oxygen, this absorbs digested food, this absorbs digested food, and this absorbs oxygen. So alveoli are present in lungs which absorbs oxygen, and villi are present in small intestine which absorbs food. So alveoli, there is also a key difference between that alveoli are made up of squamous epithelium, and villi are extension of columnar epithelium. Squamous epithelium alveoli and columnar epithelium villi. Okay, so now this is our respiratory tract. You must remember this, that in our respiratory system, the oxygen first goes through nostrils, nasal passages, nasal cavity, pharynx, larynx, trachea, bronchi, then to lungs. Okay, and this nostrils, nasal passages, and nasal cavities plays a function of filtering of the air that enters, that is protection. Nostrils are hairs present in our nose which absorb dust particles from the air and filters the air which goes inside our nose. Okay, so this is the respiratory tract. Now the mechanism of breathing. So before this mechanism, let me tell you that our lungs is present in a cavity, and this cavity is called pleural cavity. This cavity is called pleural cavity. Pleura means lungs. This cavity is called pleural cavity. So inside this cavity the lungs is present, and lungs is so present that when there is change in the volume of this pleural cavity, it leads to change in the volume of this lungs. Okay, when there is change in the volume of this cavity, that is pleural cavity, there is change in volume of lungs, and this leads to expiration and inspiration, that is exhale and inhale. Okay, now the mechanism of breathing, the first comes is inhalation. So during inhalation the thoracic cavity expands. The thoracic cavity, if like this, it expands, due to which air comes in. So when the chest cavity expands, the ribs lift up and diaphragm become flat. Diaphragm is initially like this, but during the process of inhalation it contracts and becomes flat. Which leads to the increase in the volume of thoracic cavity, and so in the volume of lungs. Now during the process of exhalation, the thoracic cavity contracts. That is, during inhalation it becomes bigger, during exhalation it becomes smaller, and due to which there is decrease in the volume of thoracic cavity, and due to the decrease in volume of thoracic cavity the lungs size decreases and it exhales out the air. So in the exhalation, ribs moves downward and diaphragm again from contraction state relaxes and becomes curved. So volume of lungs is decreased and the air from the lungs are exhaled out. Now take a look to this picture. Look, from here the lungs is pulled downward, that is, there is contraction. Lungs become like this. So pleural cavity increases. Okay, cavity increases, so there is intake of oxygen, that is air, there is intake of oxygen. And during the process of expiration, the diaphragm, which was initially like this, turns like this, and the air is released out. Along with diaphragm, this muscles, ribs, and there are also some abdominal muscles responsible for the process. So we need not to take a deep look to this, because better to do a concentrated study. So now the exchange of gases takes place through this process. The air reaches to alveolus. Alveolus, already we have discussed, are sac-like structure present in the lungs which absorb oxygen. Are absorbed in the alveolus, then it goes to blood, then it goes to RBC. Noted, RBC are carrier of oxygen. RBC is the carrier of oxygen and carbon dioxide also. So RBC is carrier of oxygen. Now this O2 is used by the tissue. And formation of carbon dioxide and oxygen takes place. So this O2 is converted into carbon dioxide, released into the blood, dissolved in plasma. Dissolves in blood plasma is approx 70%, and 20% is also carried by the RBCs. So basically the most amount of carbon dioxide is carried by dissolved in blood. Then from this blood it again goes to alveoli, and through there it goes out through the nose, and we do exhale oxygen. Now we need oxygen, but there are also organisms who live in water. So from where do they get oxygen? So the organisms which are present in aquatic lifestyle do get oxygen which are dissolved in in water. Oxygen dissolved in water. We know water. What is water? H2O. So the oxygen dissolved in water are used by the animals residing in an aquatic lifestyle, and the terrestrial atmospheric respiration. Terrestrial organisms use atmospheric oxygen. Aquatic organisms use dissolved oxygen for the respiration. Now in plants, the respiration is very cheap process, not so complex as in humans. The respiration, breathing, that is exchange of gases, takes place through stomata or sometimes lenticels, generally in xerophytes, desert plants known as xerophytes, or from the surface of the roots, like in mangrove plants. Mangrove plants takes place through roots, and generally it is from stomata, and about 99% of oxygen is 95% of gaseous exchange from environment takes place in plants through stomata. So the gaseous exchange takes place through stomata, lenticels, and general body surface, but stomata is most common. Lenticels are in some xerophytes, and the roots are, that is pneumatophoric roots, which are present in mangrove plants, are also used in the respiratory process. Now there is the end of this respiration chapter. We are on the end of this respiration chapter. So what do we study in this process? Have a quick recap. In this chapter, we studied that respiration is a process in which breathing takes place, O2 is in, CO2 is out. This O2 is utilized to break down glucose to form energy. Now respiration is of two types. One is aerobic, one is anaerobic. In anaerobic, oxygen is absent, in aerobic, oxygen is present. So in aerobic, more ATP is released, in anaerobic, less ATP is relieved. The anaerobic respiration takes place in muscles during complex exercises, which leads to form lactic acid, and in yeast it takes place and forms ethanol. Ethanol is a type of alcohol. You might have learned in the chapter carbons and compounds. So after this, we studied the pathway of respiratory pathway, which consists of lungs, which starts from nose to nostrils to larynx to trachea to tracheoles to bronchi to bronchioles and to alveoli, which are sac-like structures, and these sac-like structures are responsible for absorption of oxygen. Now this oxygen is transported to the body, where it is utilized by the tissue, and this tissue utilize oxygen to break down glucose into energy and carbon dioxide and water, and this carbon dioxide is then transported back to the alveolus, from where it is exhaled out. We also had a look on the mechanism of respiration. So during inspiration, diaphragm contracts. During expiration, diaphragm relax. So this leads to increase in volume of pleural cavity. This leads to decrease in volume of pleural cavity. So due to increase, it leads to inspiration. Due to decrease, it leads to expiration. And finally, we had a look on the respiration plants, in which air is taken through, or we can say gas exchange takes place through stomata or lenticel. Lenticel are present on stems. Openings like stomata are present on stems, and through root generally in pneumatophotic roots present in mangrove plants. Okay, so this was all about respiration. So in next lecture, we would take a look on circulation, blood circulation. That's not very complex topic, will be covered very soon. So thank you, keep learning, keep watching. Thank you, have a good